another exciting episode of Never Seen It Film Club, the film club where we watch films that you've never seen. I'm one of your co-hosts, Accidental Theatre's Emily Bainbridge, and joining me as always, the very suave, the very handsome, the very dapper, Robert J. Simpson from Cinepunkt.
Hello, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Just want to acknowledge, thank you.
I do feel like I'm like your hype man.
It's great. If I could get that at the start of I'm going to have to record it some of these days and just play it on my phone. So if I woke up to that, I might actually feel enthused about what lies ahead in the next 24 hours.
I mean, if you would like me to be your alarm clock that just gives you positive affirmations, just ask. That'd be great. Be like, hey, Robert, you're doing great today. Well done for waking up, pal. You're going to bust it. I wish I could do it for myself, but it just doesn't have the same effect when it's yourself. But anyway, yeah, I'll clip that out for you. You can make it your text alert.
Thanks.
It'll just be
Thanks.
Robert, you're doing great, and turns into Tony the Tiger. Anyway, hi, we're back. We are doing a very sophisticated film this week. Not like us.
Speak for yourself.
I do, because who curates the seasons? 'Twas Ma. But we are doing a very controversial for its time film, I feel like, and an interesting choice. It is Belle de Jour from 1967.
Je t'aime chaque jour davantage.
Un jour, il faudrait que je vous voie. Sans votre mari, naturellement. Chez Anaïs. 11 cité Jean de Saumur.
N'ayez pas peur. Vous êtes ici chez vous. Je suis toute prête à vous aider. Quand voudriez-vous commencer? Vous êtes gentille et fraîche. C'est le genre qui plaît ici. Si vous vous appeliez Belle de Jour. Oui, si vous voulez. Vous avez quelqu'un qui vous attend? Un petit ami? Un petit mari?
So, that is the trailer over. Well done, me, for putting that in. I had actually never seen Belle de Jour before.
It's like you've almost done what we're supposed to say. Neither had I don't believe.
Ooh. So we've both followed the rules of the film club and have never seen it. Interesting. This is like this. I think
It's not very often this happens.
it doesn't.
No.
Usually one of us has seen it. But yeah, I don't know why I had just never had the opportunity to watch it. And I'm not big on French cinema, apart from like Celine Sciamma because gay. But that's the only person's films I've watched. There's no reason for me not to like it. It's very interesting, very cool. I feel like as a film studies student, it was beaten into me so much that I'm like, recreationally, don't want to watch it.
Yeah, I mean, I have no issues with French cinema. I'm very fond of it. For me, it was being introduced to Luis Buñuel's films, and as a young film student, they did not connect with me properly at all, and I then avoided every other film of his. And I'm pretty sure I must have handled a VHS copy of this at some stage in the past and gone, oh, it's directed by Luis Buñuel. Put that back.
That's very fair. I mean,
It's not though.
No. I think it is though but my surprise is that how like experimental and kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like avant-garde and creepy, weird films that he likes. Like he's very surrealist. I thought he'd been right up your street.
Wait.
Huh? Quoi? Hi guys, editing Emma here. Bet you didn't think you'd see me.
Surprise, bitch. I bet you thought you'd seen the last of me.
Unfortunately, life isn't perfect, much like Never Seen It Film Club. And unfortunately, for reasons still unknowns to me, our camera stopped recording partway through this episode. And I say partway through, it's pretty much at the very beginning. Luckily though, we record our audio separately, so you are going to enjoy our podcast, I hope. I've added some fun videos in lieu of my decrepit features and Robert's ever so handsome face. So I hope you enjoy. There might even be some sock puppets because everybody loves puppets.
Everyone loves puppets.
Everyone loves puppets.
And we'll hopefully see you next time on Never Seen It Film Club. Enjoy. My surprise is that how like experimental and kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like avant-garde and creepy, weird films that he likes. Like he's very surrealist. I thought he'd been right up your street.
Wait.
Huh? Quoi?
Yeah, I mean, really, he should have been. And I don't know what it was. It's that whole thing. Like, it depends on how you encounter a film, and sometimes it's you're in the wrong frame of mind, or you haven't. Particularly, like I think as a film student, you're sort of encountering a lot of stuff for the first time, a lot of ideas for the first time. And if I've seen something else that's really landed with me and something else that hasn't. I'm more likely to pursue the thing that's got me enthused at that point. I think that's what happened. It wasn't that I didn't like French cinema. I loved French cinema, and it wasn't that I didn't like surrealism, because I adore surrealism. But Buñuel just wasn't doing it for me. I think it was, I want to say it was L'Âge d'Or I watched, and I didn't like it, and I haven't watched it since. Because it was that and Enchanting is his other big one. And Enchanting I kind of like. Sort of. It's short enough to like. But yeah, I think L'Âge d'Or really put me off Buñuel, and I've maybe been unfair in that, and I'm sure my former prof will be looking down or up from wherever he's ended up and be shouting at me for not appreciating it. But yeah, I feel, having watched this, maybe it was just the wrong moment, and now I feel ready to experiment.
Ooh. Well, on that note, no, for me, watching it for the first time, again, not having super good knowledge, like the only thing I knew was that it was all like from my parents being like, "Oh, it's a dirty film."
Hey, that's a dirty movie.
That's it. Like anytime, like Catherine Deneuve would be brought up. Like in interviews and stuff, and any time that like growing up you would see her be referenced to like Belle de Jour. I remember my parents being like, oh, it's a dirty film. And like, so that's all I knew about it, which surprises me that I did not watch it with enthusiasm the second I turned 18, because we all know what a pervert I am.
Move it, you little pervert.
I don't know if it was the French thing or the surrealism thing that put me off, because I, again, really love experimental weird films, but similar to yourself, not massively dove into that kind of side of like Buñuel's films. I'm just like, I don't know what put me off. I think what put me off was my film studies professor was really into him, and I did not like him very much, so I immediately did not want to like anything that he liked. So I went the other direction. So with world cinema, I looked into like Hungarian cinema and like Mexican cinema and things like that, rather than classically French. I think also I was a very try-hard film student, because I think if you like film and you're into French cinema, it's kind of like basic, in my opinion, because every trope out there, it's like if you see a filmmaker in a film, especially, this is more like for Americans and stuff, but they're always into French cinema. Like, I'm into like the Umbrellas of Schönberg is just the most romantic thing that's ever happened to cinema. And I'm like, those people make me want to gouge my own eyes out, because they're also the very, like, in my head, if you like French cinema, you like it because you're trying deliberately to be a bit pretentious.
Fine cinema.
French.
Cinema nouveau.
I do not have that opinion anymore. Lots of my friends love French cinema. They're not pretentious. They're very well-rounded individuals who also like the Saw films. So it's all good. But I think in my youth, there was like, I had this certain blockage about French film. And for me, like, Belle de Jour was just a name that I associated with like pretentious wankerism and dirty films. So I didn't watch it.
I mean, I think that's also fair that as a student, possibly the content may still have been just a little bit too racy for me and my developing tastes. No, it's very hard to know like at what point you start introducing people to some of those more adult themes whenever they're going through that whole transition from particularly in Northern Ireland, where we're so repressed.
Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
To go from that kind of adolescent schooling, and deeply religious at every school just about in Northern Ireland is, for those of you who aren't in Northern Ireland watching this, to go from that into university and big bad world and all sorts of ideas. And I think also because it's about prostitution and sex work, there are still stigmas around that globally that I think still resonate. I mean, what I love about French sexuality, particularly within the cinema. I don't know what it's like on the streets, but certainly as it's presented within literature and film, French sexuality is quite open to ideas and fuzzy relationships and, you know, all kinds of interesting things about polyamorous relationships, I guess, and what fidelity actually means in a way that the sort of the UK and the US are far more restrictive.
Yeah.
And so it's quite exciting to kind of watch those things, but it also means it's quite controversial still, and it's quite uncomfortable sometimes because you're kind of excited by the openness and the freeness within the film, but at the same time there's that inbuilt sort of repression kind of going at the back of my head. This is wrong, as you said. It's a dirty film.
It's a dirty film.
Dirty film.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. I think French attitudes towards sex have been stereotyped in media since it existed. The whole thing of, like, you know, particularly with French male sexuality, like, you can be married and it's very open that you have a mistress is like a big trope that we see in media and film, and it's kind of like the taboo of what does it, if it doesn't fit into traditional monogamy, then it's wrong and evil. And it's very interesting to me because I don't ever think of France as a particularly religious country, but it's very deeply Catholic.
Yeah.
This is the thing, but and I think part of that is because the repression around sexuality is so different to everywhere else in the world. So they are very, like, obviously very religious.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church has a stronghold in France and just like most other places. But because there's not that immediate disgust with sex and sexuality, it's an open conversation. It's not a taboo subject in French cinema. And in particular, one of the things that I do find about modern French cinema, which kind of started, like, I would say in the 60s and around the 70s, is the way that films, like French films, treat sex. It's almost, I don't want to say pornographic, but in a lot of French cinema, the actors are actually having sex on camera, or they're very close to actually engaging in sex. Not in a way that would be seen in Hollywood films, for example. And one of my favourite filmmakers, John Cameron Mitchell, very heavily comments on that. He produced a film that I am still very hesitant to admit that I like, because despite all of myself, I do get a little queasy at the thought that, I'm going to recommend this film. I love this film. It's about human connection and, like, the taboos and polyamory and you know, how we view sex. He did a film in the early 2000s called Short Bus, which is very influenced by that kind of French gaze of the French cinematic gaze of sex is just a part of life. So we shouldn't taboo it and we shouldn't glorify it, which is something that I find very interesting watching back on it, because again, there's real sex in Short Bus. It's like, it's very openly queer, and there's lots of fluids everywhere. Not for everybody, but at the end of the day, it's about human connection, which I think ultimately that's what sex is. It's just another form of connection with people, and I think that's something that this film does very well. Which surprised me. It feels very modern watching it, I have to say. Like, I believe it's based on a novel, but there's a lot of changes.
1928 novel by Joseph Cassel.
Yeah.
Also called Belle de Jour, which seems to be part of a sort of a series of novels. I haven't read it.
No,
to be honest. I've read the synopsis.
It's more than I did. I vaguely went, I think there's a book. And you went, I read the synopsis.
I've read enough to find out some of the differences between the film and the book. And it's interested me enough. I think the film interested me enough that I wanted to read the book to see how the sexuality is portrayed in that in the 20s. I think that would certainly be interesting. Would be interesting. Maybe it wouldn't be. It's piqued my curiosity enough, you know. Yeah.
I think again, like, it's something unexpected about history is that the 20s for me is such an openly sexual era, but like things behind it. But you had like Lolita and stuff was written around that time and then came out in the 30s. I think Morris, that is another book, a film based on a book that came out in the 20s, which is about homosexual love. Like there's like a lot of kind of more open and I think it's because psychology became such an interesting subject for people, and psychoanalyzing and Freud.
Yeah.
Our relationship with sex became more open around that time. So you find a lot of books coming out of that era are surprisingly weird and kinky and like explore things that feel very fresh, but just go to prove that they're not, that it's always been there.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think there's stuff that's happening. There's a seismic change, particularly thanks to Freud.
Seismic change, Freud.
Freud would say you're compensating. Ever met Freud? No.
And then hampered by sort of wartime progression.
Yeah.
You know, that changes a lot of things and sort of stifles a lot of stuff. And then post-war, I mean, you've got differing. I mean, again, you know, that we're here in the UK and Ireland, right? Well, we're in the UK, and Ireland actually has a separate kind of trajectory, completely different trajectory actually to what the UK does. And then you have everything else that happens in the 60s. And 60s is obviously a massive period of revolution. It's the sexual kind of revolution. It's the dawning of the pill and everything else. And this feels quite tied in with that moment. You know, as abortion is legalized in 67 here, you got the...
All these years I've stayed at home while you had all your fun. And every year that's gone by, another baby's come. There's gonna be some changes made right here on Nursery Hill. You set this chicken your last time, 'cause now I've got the pill.
The pill being available, that's all here in the moment this film is made. But there is also, I'm also kind of aware about the stifling that still goes on without. So I mean, you know, you're talking about some of the literature that comes out, and one of the books that occurred to me watching this was Lady Chatterley's Lover, which you know ended up resulting in massive court cases because it was still deemed by some to be too bold. That kind of frankness about sexuality was regarded as pornographic, which again I think is part of the reason why I'm interested in seeing what the original source material for this, how it approached things. But our attitudes have changed so much since then. That it's very hard to view this film in anything like the sense of what it must have been like to watch then. I kind of wish I had seen this as a student, because as a student I may have responded to it more like somebody watching it for the first time in the 1960s. Yeah, no,
I think one of the shames of film is that you cannot watch it in its original context. I think much as because as a person who loves watching kind of retro cinema and like going back further and further, and I find my taste in film going back to like the 70s and the 60s now, and that's where I'm seeking out. I'm like, God, it must have been cool to watch this for the first time with like no prior probably knowledge of like the kind of kink scene or like brothels, like especially being like someone from the UK where it's always kind of alluded to, but you never actually know what the heck is going on. And I think the fact that this film starts with a fantasy says everything that you need to know.
It's not just a fantasy, it's a BDSM fantasy.
It's a very good fantasy scene because it's driven by just like every repressed schoolgirl kind of thing that you can think of is in that scene, which is like, it's BDSM, it's masochism. It's also the fact that he's like, ultimately it boils down to where she's like, ugh, you're too sweet for me. Get the fuck away. I'm like, whatever. And then he's like, oh, well, really? And then all that happens. You're like, yes,
the female need to constantly be like, oh yeah, I just want a nice guy, like all the time. Sometimes you want to be slapped around a bit with consent, obviously, but sometimes. But I mean, to see that, like, I remember, like, what was this, a week ago, watching this and it took me by surprise, and I'm not easily shocked. And I'm like, imagine being like a 20-year-old, probably freshly married, like, person living over here. You've barely had sex, probably, and you go to see this nice French film that you don't know what it's about, and then you see that, and I'm just like, imagine the world this opened up for people.
Imagine the conversations on the way home.
Well, see, this is, honestly, it's one of those things where I'm just like, oh yeah, I can see why it's a dirty film now. But it's just so interesting to me that the decision was made, because those fantasies are not in the novel. That I know for sure. Those are something that Buñuel put in because he felt like you needed to see why she's driven and also give her some agency, which I thought was quite good.
I mean, here's where I'm not sure how much I can talk about sort of the source. From what I'd read about it, she is keen on her on the sadomasochistic end of things. So that's part of her sexuality and her drive. And that's kind of her frustration, is that her partner doesn't give her that. And to talk about that in the 1960s even feels quite groundbreaking.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's still quite taboo. I mean, fuck. You have those conversations. Pardon, I said a bad word. I have to stop that. You have those conversations with your friends and family today, and you're going to get a look that suggests that that's taboo and inappropriate, unless you're part of certain communities.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, even 50 Shades hasn't really kind of, I mean, it's made people slightly more aware, 50 Shades and Secretary, but it hasn't really stopped the kind of the expressions of disgust and shame that surround a confession to, I like my stuff like this.
Yeah, no, totally. Like, I will confess, when I saw 50 Shades of Grey, I was bitterly disappointed with how vanilla it was, because the way that people were talking about it. And that made me question, oh, okay, so if people think that this is really kinky, what the fuck am I into? Do you know? No, but that's a conversation for a different podcast. What's the Safe Word, perhaps, which is an excellent podcast. Amp, if you ever see this, big fan. Mr. Christopher, you too, very handsome, very lovely gay gentleman who have a kink positive podcast that I listen to. That's very good. But no, it's something that does get brought up. It's like, and it still baffles me to this day how we're in 2024 and it's still, I think it is slightly like this much more acceptable to admit that, you know, you like a little bit of choking. You like to be tied up, maybe. You like a little spank every now and again. That's seen as like, it's still seen as quite like hardcore and like, ooh. And I'm like, guys, let's all grow up here. We all have played cops and robbers as children and been tied up and felt a little something that we weren't sure what it was. And now as an adult, we do know what it is. But you know what I mean? It's like this is, again, it's this taboo around sex. Like, we're so repressed, especially over here. The mere talking of vanilla sex freaks people out. As soon as you add anything that is not
missionary,
just missionary, just missionary. As soon as you say it's sex with accessories, people get freaked out.
Anything that's not missionary heterosexual sex freaks a lot of people out.
It does.
So anything that's on the rest of that fantastic spectrum is a no-go. But I think, I mean, there's a few things in this film that took me by surprise. I mean, it's a film, and in a sense, it's about fantasy and it's about performance. And it's not entirely clear at any point in the film, really, as to how much of this is fantasy and how much of this is actually what's going on, which bits are which. But not only do you have these sort of BDSM fantasies that she's having, like Catherine Deneuve's character, Severin, the Belle de Jour, is having. But there's also other people having similar fantasies. There's a gentleman who they encounter in the brothel who basically wants to be a slave. He's a sex slave, and he's got his whip. And as soon as he come out with the whip, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is going to go somewhere. I did not expect to see a film in what is broadly mainstream cinema in 1967 to do.
Yeah.
I thought it was quite... I actually goes as far as goes as far as him telling her to walk all over his face, which really took me by surprise, because I don't think I've actually ever seen that depicted anywhere else in cinema.
In a non-jokey way. Because I think this might be a problem with modern cinema, but I'm thinking more of like those typical sex teen comedies where there will be a dominatrix.
Oh, and she's always the object of fun.
Object of fun, being made fun of, and more so her, like anyone who's seriously interested.
Yeah.
Is a object of ridicule.
Did you say Flügelkämmchen?
Yes, yes. For the love of God, Flügelkämmchen.
Are you sure?
Yes, please.
As you wish.
Bring on the Flügelkämmchen! Whereas this guy, first of all, the fact that he's a gynecologist, I'm like, well done, sir. Good job. But he's a well-respected member of society, and this is how it depicts him as this is his release, and he wants to be. It's that typical thing of like men in power like to be submissive. It's a trope that the kink community are very much aware of, I'm sure, and the rest of society are. But the fact is that my favorite part of that scene is that he's really into it, and he wants all that, and he's asking for his desires. There's a bit where the sex worker goes to whip him too soon, and he goes, wait, no, it's too early, and she goes, sorry, and it's the funniest. I don't think it's intended to be as funny as it is, but I laughed my ass off because she's so out of character so quickly, and then goes back into it, like, because he's scripted this scene out in his head, and he's thought about it, and and I think what's nice about that is that it shows that I think sometimes desire and fantasy is seen as like it's either seen as this really gross obsessive thing or something that you can just come to, but it's like, no, he's got his play-by-play in his head. That's what he wants to happen. Let's just go for it. And it's not, and again, the sex worker doesn't ridicule him for it. She's not like, she doesn't make fun of him. It's not like a joke that he's really into this. It's like, this is our job. We're going to do it. This is what he likes. Boom. And when Severine can't do it initially, it's because all of her fantasies, she's submissive. So again, that's quite funny to have like a submissive try to be told to be dominant by someone who wants to be submissive, and you're like, oh yeah, no, that wouldn't work. But yeah, I think the fact that he's saying these things out loud and isn't being an object of ridicule, and that's certainly not the gaze the camera gives us either.
No, I mean it's generally quite accepting of people's sexualities and their whatever it is that they're into. It's not making. I mean, even Severine's fantasies are not the object of judgment from anyone other than herself potentially. You know, it's not like she's having a conversation with her husband about that being inappropriate, because what he says is, was it that dream again? So they've obviously had a conversation, and he's aware of elements of whatever's going on in her head. Which again seems like quite a sex positive attitude to have within the film. That said, there's still a healthy dose of toxic masculinity.
Would it be a film, and specifically a French film, if there wasn't?
Well, probably not. I mean, Marcel is an expression I seem to use far too often. Deeply problematic. But also is very typical, I think, of sort of a lot of men. He's a slight bit of rough. He's kind of he's quirky, attractive. He's pretentious as anything with his big dick substitution cane.
Yes.
That said, if you ever see me walking down the street with a cane, it's not a dick substitute. It's because I got back issues, honest. But you're kind of watching that, and then he's the one that she kind of falls for, but then he wants to have control of her.
Yeah.
And it's interesting as well, I think, to compare him to the husband, because actually the husband is not trying to control her.
No.
And I get that she wants to be controlled as part of her fantasies, but there's a limit, as you said, there's you've alluded to the podcast, but what's the safe word? There needs to be a point where you can kind of go, this is inappropriate. The boundaries of the relationships within the brothel are a little bit more, it's quite homely. Like there's literally a family there. It's not quite as clinical as a lot of the depictions we would say of sex work. It's not just like the prostitutes and the Johns. This is, they're not just racking up the Bois de Boulogne for a ride in a car and then spat back out. They're literally kind of coming into what's like quite a closey, kind of flat environment. There's a small community of sex workers there. There's regular customers to the point where everyone's quite pally.
Yeah.
And even though money changes hands, I think the relationship lines are definitely blurred. And that creates, I suppose that allows the men to feel that they have this ability to be more controlling and demanding of the people whenever they decide. I mean, you've also got the issue with Henry Husson, who's the sort of the guy that she knows in the outside world who's always trying to get into her pants. Frequently in front of her husband. Like, he doesn't care.
He's creepy.
But he's also quite blasé about his own sex life. And then in order for him to take control of a situation, he decides he doesn't want to have sex with her after all. But what he does want to do is to make sure that her husband knows everything about her.
Yeah. I think ultimately...
I've talked a lot, sorry.
No. I'm going to jump in.
Please.
Just to say, yes, I completely agree. I think ultimately what this film does very well is show boundaries exist with every relationship. I think what's interesting to me is that anytime I've seen a film that is like a dirty film or like a sexy film, it's ultimately never about the actual act of sex. It's not about that side of it. It is about the relationships that drive us to those desires. So like Séverine, it's not that she doesn't love her husband. That's never a question. It's not. She's not going to leave him. She's like that side. They're very sweet, and he's very affectionate. He's very sweet. He respects her boundaries. They sleep in separate beds. Ultimately, during the flashbacks, you get a sense that she's had physical abuse in her past. It's something that she struggles with, and he seems to be, even though he does make the occasional remark of a sexually frustrated person, you ultimately get the idea that he genuinely loves her, she genuinely loves him, and there's boundaries in place he respects, that he's not going to force himself on her when she doesn't want that. And ultimately, any relationship that she's engaged in, apart from Hussam, who is the creepy worst person ever, I fucking hate that character, it's all her choice. So even when she starts working in the brothel, she has opportunities to leave. You never get the sense that the only person stopping her doing that is herself. Like, there's never a sense that she's in real danger of anything untowards. Like, for example, when the gynecologist come in for his scene, she says, I can't do that. She's not like taken away and beaten down and like left in a corner. It's like, no, watch, this is how you can pretend to do that. There's like a nurturing relationship there, which is odd, but there we go. So ultimately, I think all of those relationships have very clear boundaries in place, which is incredibly healthy, even if it doesn't come from a good place. As you said, the regulars are all very, like, they're masculine, and they're like being a little, like, the first guy is a little creepy and whatever, but the sense you get is that nobody in that brothel feels unsafe, which again is a flip on kind of like any kind of British media, where it's either really dirty, grotty, or very kind of, as you said, jumping in and out of cars, and it's very clinically transactional done, but there's no emotion involved, blah, blah, blah. Which again, I think it's interesting because I think there's this stigma around sex work, obviously till this day, where everybody tars every sex worker with the brush of you're doing this because you have no other choice. And I think this film in particular poses an interesting question of like, well, what if you did have a choice? And what if you could do that? And what if you could fill out your fantasies on your own terms to a certain extent? I mean, again, I don't want to like overly praise it because at the end of the day, this is a rich middle class woman who's kind of got money and security and a husband that loves her, and she's not in any real danger of losing that at any point. So, I mean, it's a little blurry for me, but I think what you said about the boundaries, though, it's an interesting way of looking at it. And in particular, I say that there is a scene. And it's, again, I like the blurring of the fantasies in this because you never are quite sure what's reality and what's fantasy. The one time that made me very uncomfortable was the guy who wants her to go in the coffin dressed as his daughter.
Le Duc.
And then you don't know what he's up to under the coffin, but you can kind of guess.
Yeah.
That made me a little uncomfortable. I'm not kink shaming anybody. I really am not, but that made me a little like heebie-jeebied.
There's a little. I mean, I think if she wasn't dressed in the diaphanous nightgown, I might allow it as some kind of grief process thing, and he's picked up a prostitute because they're somebody who will fulfill a role for money and understand the transaction. But there is definitely a hint of pedo about that. There's also a little bit of a hint of necrophilia about that in terms of that setup. And I mean, that's creepy, but she seems complicit and willing. I mean, it's one of the rare moments of minor unsafe is whenever she's then thrown out of the house by the servant, who's someone who's not engaged in the sex work himself.
Yeah.
Who would be of a rank similar to her, doing whatever his boss tells him to get paid. And he just throws her out onto the streets, even though it's torrenting down. And I mean, I think the only two times where really you feel unsafe is then, and also when you have a new person come into the brothel, and that's Marcel, who it turns out everyone is right to. Yeah, you should be a little bit afraid of Marcel. I mean, anyone who's got like that many gold teeth and
very long trench coat.
Yeah, it's a trench coat. It's the problem. It looks it's vampiric.
It is quite vampiric, and it is very like old danger boy.
It's very affected, is how he strikes, and his swagger is quite something. His sense of entitlement is quite shocking, and he's got that sort of, there's a youthful arrogance about him because he comes with his older friend who knows the system, is quite well respected and treats the women with respect.
I do have a little bit of a crush on Marcel, but only because he reminds me of every boy I've ever dated. Like, if that doesn't tell you like my type, I don't know, but like being like, yeah. I'm like, ooh, a leather trench coat and a sense of entitlement and a long emo boy haircut. Sign me up. Marcel, but he is definitely the most attractive person in the film. But I don't know if, again, I could be just blindsided by teenage Emma. But no, 100%. Like, he is like, you do get the sense that he's less in control of himself because of his youth almost. It's like he has that kind of inexperience of life that the other guys who visit the brothel and her husband ultimately have, where they're like, it's you'll get over this kind of need to assert your dominance and like physically in every situation you're in with your giant walking stick.
Barge your way through with your tool.
Yeah,
I mean, it is a very apt metaphor.
It is,
I think.
yeah.
I mean, the one thing we haven't sort of touched on properly, though, which I think again it's an observation about how the sexual about how the French attitude is maybe different from certainly from Northern Ireland. Is about the attitude about the men towards sex work generally, and whilst the men don't pass an awful lot of comment about the the women who choose to do sex work. It's other women are commenting on women that choose to do sex work. But all of the men in this film appear to have used sex workers as a kind of, even her husband. Like, she does ask him, "You've been to those kind of places? I mean, and what's it like?" And he's a bit reluctant. Whether that's because, he's admitting that he's I don't know quite what the reluctance is about. Maybe just it's impolite to talk about people you fucked in front of the person that you're not fucking. But he, even he's used them, and they're all okay with this. Like, the men are all okay with women like this, but maybe it's, as you said, it's this is a culture where we're under the impression that every man has a mistress.
Yeah.
That there is a kind of a different understanding of what is expected of you within a relationship, about where your lines are, about the fact that these people can be engaged and married and have no difficulty in working, literally using sex for work, and being in a loving relationship, and those two things are not mutually incompatible.
I think there's something that because we've said, French society, very open, blah, 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 blah. I think there's something inherently masculine still about admitting that you like sex and, actively engaging in that world. And I think that's sometimes where the women-on-women crime comes from, where it's ultimately, deep down, it's you're doing something that is reserved. As a woman, you're doing something that's reserved for men to want, carnal desires and wanting sex outside of the marriage bed, for lack of a better term, is seen as something quite masculine and dominant. And ultimately, if we want to get back into the religion thing, the Bible is very clear on spreading seed and male sexuality and male virility being a good thing, whereas female sexuality and female virility is not viewed in the same way. And I wonder if that's why that attitude's kind of been portrayed across by the women, because the men kind of understand it, where they're oh yeah, I could see why you would do this. I enjoy sex. Why wouldn't you? But so that just begs the question, do the married women just don't enjoy sex? I'm well, in my experience, I don't know. Haven't slept with a lot of married women, but I don't know. They might not. But so I think that's where that comes from, because that is again something that I see a lot in media, and that I notice a lot in media is it's women on women crime that is the problem. For the most part, yes, men can and men are just as disgusted by sex work, but with a broader brush, in the broadest strokes, it does tend to be that women hate more, and it's almost out of a jealousy of the ability to express yourself from a sexual point of view. It's also this better than thing that women do. As someone who went to an all girls school for several years, I can tell you that it is real, the whole I'm better than you because I do X, Y, and Z, or I don't do X, Y, and Z and you do. It's a very real behind the back thing that women do to each other. And ultimately it is the patriarchy's fault, but we don't have enough time on this podcast to go into that theory. But yeah, no, it is very interesting. But I do think it's kind of the same way that food is viewed, I think, in some ways, whereas men are very much into like steak, potatoes, delicious food, indulge as much as you can, whereas women are I'll have a side salad because a healthy appetite means a healthy appetite for something else, and it goes on. And I think that motif plays out in cinema quite a lot as well. Not in this film so much, but there are a lot of scenes in restaurants, and they go to visit Hussein. They're with the ski lodge or in the cafes and stuff, and there's near a hot chocolate in sight, and all those uptight bitches are mad about it. But I don't know. Anyway, I've talked for too long now, so I'm going to take the point back to Robert while I have this delicious boost. Not sponsored, but Maybe someday.
I think where I want to go with this.
I think from a stylistic point as well. I think the fantasies are kind of hinted at with little. I say with little, but like there's like the very end where it transitions. There's like a really slow dissolve over Severin's house and the forest from the very opening of the film.
Yeah.
And there's two endings. And I think that's a motif that goes through Brunel's work as well, is that he gives the audience a choice. It's like a pick your own adventure. So you can either choose that the ending happens in the house and the husband is miserable and shot and his wife's a whore and he hates his life and she's been found out and what's going to happen. Or you can choose to believe that everything's fine. And it was all a fantasy and that actually nothing's real and why does it matter? And I personally love that.
I mean, again, I suppose that's tied in with other sort of psychoanalysis ideas, that there is a kind of duality within everybody, that there are always options. I mean, but the fantasy extends into her real world and her real world extends into the fantasy, and it does become unclear, particularly again because we have got her as the performance nature of prostitution, which is something I kind of, I felt as well watching last month's Bound, was that, again, a lot of that is tied up with this element of performance, that you had somebody who's an ex-sex worker, you've got somebody who's performing the role of something else, and then you've got the people pretending to be mobsters. I mean, everyone is pretending to be something. They're behaving in a way that they're expected to behave, and they're also going through their own thought processes, and we're kind of given a glimpse into some of it. And I mean, that kind of fantasy element starts finding its way over into the British New Wave as well. Like this might be a very French Nouvelle Vague sort of way of approaching your film, but it does find its way into other people's work. And I think about I always seem to end up thinking about Nick Rogue and Don't Look Now whenever I start thinking about these sorts of films, because again, he's blurring that line between what is real, what's perceived, and again, it's a quite a sexually charged film. I have to say, I enjoyed it quite a lot, and I mean, even just the conversation we've had up to now is there's plenty there to think about, and it's one I probably would revisit and explore more of Buñuel's work. I also kind of feel I need to watch the Embellished of Cherbourg after watching this, just to kind of contrast and compare, because that was sort of the film that she'd done, I think, just before this one.
Yeah, so basically she'd done Umbrellas of Cherbourg and
Les Parapluies de Cherbourg.
Oh wow. Oh, I'm just going to play that in the loop. But basically, Deneuve was not Brunel's first choice. He was like, she is just this fluff actress and I don't want to work with her. And apparently, and again, just watching some interviews with her prior to this, she talks about this quite openly, where she's like, I did not have the best time on this set, but and there are moments where I think she does, like her performance is a little ropey in places, but I think ultimately by the end, I think you can see that they began to understand each other, and and then she works with him several other times, and I think she's in his, isn't City in his last film, because he died 13 years after this, and I don't. Right. But anyway, there's a whole debate. We'll not go into that. But yeah, so she was I think it's quite interesting that she was like this romantic, like kind of lead and like this fluffy actress type. And then and then the studio was like, yes, cast her please as Belle de Jour, because she's like this beautiful. And again, like seeing that in the 60s must have been really, really strange.
Well, I suppose she looks like someone who could be the pretty girl next door, who's in the young married, a very ordinary sort, kind of classy, and it's that whole thing is like, you can't judge by appearances, because inside that pretty little shell there's the most thwarted thoughts.
Wow. If that's not the message of this film, I don't know what is. But yeah, no, I would agree. I think I thoroughly enjoyed it. I would definitely watch it again. I'm sad I haven't seen it to this point, but also I am kind of glad that I've reached a level of acceptance of myself and understanding of otherworldly dirty things, to not be like surprised and shocked by it, but to enjoy it for the kind of nuance it has and like the kind of exploration of sexuality is. And again, people argue that this is not a feminist film, and it's definitely not a feminist film, but I would say it's not a feminist film. I feel like there is enough consultation with women in this film and enough agency that have been given that allows it gives you permission to talk about your sexuality a little bit, and I never think that's a bad thing. So I definitely will be adding this to the rotation and rewatching it. Definitely a juicy, interesting conversation starter, especially if, like, as the season is, it's sex positivity, and I think our conversation has proved that it works. So watch it and have a discussion amongst yourselves and let us know how that went in the comments below.
I was going to say something highly inappropriate there, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, let's not go there. But anyway,
if you've been inspired to visit a sex worker after this, do let us know.
How'd that go? Did you bring your own whip, or did they provide one for you? Anyway, thank you for joining us today on Never Seen It Film Club. We have been Emma and Robert, and we are not sex workers yet. Although if our arts council funding gets any worse, who knows?
We're sexy workers.
There we go.
I think that's close enough.
Oh, God. Oh, could we start an OnlyFans, but it's just us talking about weird films? That would be class. Anyway.
Only films.
Only films? Yes! Okay. Join us next time on Only Films. Right. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to follow Accidental Theatre and support us, it would mean a lot to us. You can follow us on most things at Accidental Theatre. We're very easy to find. Just Google it or search in the crowbar. We're in Belfast. Come check us out. If you want to follow Robert Cinepunkt, you can do at the following things.
Yes, do it legitimately via the internet. You can follow Cinepunkt on most places as Cinepunkt. Occasionally we're Cinepunkt Film, and you'll find me under my own name, but also as Avalard. So come chat, say hi.
Do all the things. Thanks. Bye.
Au revoir.